Hi, everyone. Welcome to our April Writers to Watch program. This is a program that the Library Love Fest team, the HarperCollins Library Marketing team, but we call ourselves Library Love Fest because that's how we feel every day when we get to talk to librarians. It's just a big love fest. And we're excited to welcome you to our fourth installment. This is April of a new program. We have some authors on. We talk about their books. Like tonight, we'll see a lot of images that go along with the book, give you some behind the scenes details. And we're really excited to have you. We have very amazing, empowering women's stories tonight, both fiction and nonfiction. And we can't wait to get started. So hi, Grace. I'm Lena, by the way.
Hi, I'm Grace. I'm really excited for tonight. There's really nothing I love more than books and history.
Yeah, and well, you're in for a great night then, if that's what you love, because it's going to be a love fest of all those things. So I think without further ado, we're going to go on. We're going to have our first author on to speak. First, we're going to welcome Kim Alkemade. Hi, Kim.
Hi, everybody.
Hi. Thank you so much for being here with us. We can't wait to hear more about Counting Lost Stars. But we first want to hear a little intro. So I'm going to introduce you. Kim, excuse me, Kim Van Alkemade is the New York Times bestselling author of the historical novels Orphan No. 8 and Bachelor Girl. Born in Manhattan, she grew up in New Jersey and went to college in Wisconsin, where she studied for she earned a PhD in English. For many years, she was professor at Shippensburg University in Pennsylvania, and now full-time writer. She resides in Saratoga Springs, New York, with her partner, 2 rescue dogs, and 2 feisty backyard chickens, which I want to hear more about. Welcome, Kim. Please tell us more about Counting Lost Stars. It goes on sale July 18th.
Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, so Counting Lost Stars, it's the story of it's 2 time periods. So we start with Rita Klein, and she's a young woman in New York City in 1960. She's attending Barnard College, and she's studying in this new field of computing machines. And even though we tend to think of women in tech as something we're working towards, actually at the beginning of the computer era, women were really essential, especially in programming. So my character, Rita Klein, attends, it's called the Watson Laboratory. Oh, I'm going to mix up the name of it for real. the Watson Computing Laboratory. It's on the campus of Columbia University. It's still there today. And I have a picture that was really inspirational as I was writing these scenes. This is a photograph that was taken at the Watson Laboratory. It's in an old building off the campus of Columbia University near Barnard. And programming at this time, around 1960, it meant programming a circuit board to work with punch cards. And that was how the computers worked. So what you see here is the teacher, his name is Hinkham, Mr. Hinkham. He's at a big board showing you how if you wire the control panel a certain way, it makes certain connections, and that's how you actually program the computer. But what really inspired me about this photograph is in this entire room of men, there's one woman sitting in the front row. And in my mind, that's my character, Rita Klein. And so you can put the photo away for a second, and I'll tell you a little more about what happens to Rita. She's taking this class. She's really interested in programming, but one of the men in the class, a salesman from IBM upstate, starts to date her, and she becomes pregnant. At which point he's like, "Oh no, I have family already. Never mind. I have nothing to do with you." So Rita becomes an unwed mother in 1960, and this is a time period that weirdly we can relate to a lot more now than we could a few months ago. Abortion is illegal, birth control is illegal for unmarried women. It was part of what was called the baby scoop era, when the typical thing that happened for a young unmarried woman who became pregnant is she would go off to an unwed mother's home that was associated with an adoption agency. She would give birth, the baby would go immediately for adoption, a closed adoption. She'd never know what happened. And the idea was that you pretended it never occurred. You went home after a few months, you said you were visiting a sick aunt or something, and that was the way it was supposed to work. And that's what happened for millions of American women from about the end of World War II up through the 1960s. And I have a picture that goes with this idea of the unwed mother. This was a film actually that came out around that time. The anguish, the horror, the shame. And this was really the feelings associated with this idea. And at least one thing that has changed is our attitudes about single mothers. But there was, many families felt so much shame that they didn't know how to support their daughters. So this is what occurs to my character, Rita. And after the unwed mother's home, she gives up her baby. She goes back to work. Everything is supposed to be normal now. So you can put that slide away. What happens in the story, she starts working in the Empire State Building at a company that works with computers. And she meets a young man named Jacob Nassi, who's a Holocaust survivor. He's a Dutch immigrant from the Netherlands. And he's searching for his lost mother. He last saw her in Westerbork, which was a transit camp in the Netherlands. And Rita finds out that the punch card computers she's learned how to program were actually used during the Holocaust to organize the concentration camp system. And that is true. And I have another picture of a punch card. This was something I came across in my research. This is from an primary document in the archive of the YIVO Center for Jewish Research at the Center for Jewish History. I saw this in person, and it was a testimony written by a man who was actually imprisoned first in Westerbork and then in Bergen-Belsen. And he was assigned to work in the labor office of the concentration camp where they had a punch card computer. And one of the things this man, his name was Rudolf Chaim, he memorized the codes that they used to sort through the prisoners and keep track of everybody. So you can put that one away. I learned about the idea that computers were used during the Holocaust from Edwin Black's book, IBM and the Holocaust, which has been out for years now. So it's not like I discovered something that nobody knew, but many people are really unfamiliar with this aspect of World War II history. And I just found it really fascinating, this idea that something that seems so incomprehensible was actually made possible by business machines. It just made it extra creepy. But as Rita decides she's going to help Jacob try to find his mother, she follows the trail of these computer cards, and that leads her to Cornelia Vogel, who's our other protagonist. She's working in the Netherlands during World War II, and she's working in the Ministry of Information, helping to create the census data that will locate the Jewish people in the Netherlands for arrest and transportation, mostly to Auschwitz. And I have a picture, my last picture that you can see. This is a actual photograph from a short film that was done at the Westerbork transit camp in the Netherlands. And it was colorized as part of a different film project, but this is a still from that film. The Jewish people in the Netherlands experienced a higher mortality rate than any other Jewish population in Western Europe, partly because of how efficient the census data was. And so we can put that sad picture away and just know that in my story, Cornelia Vogel, who's working with this information, decides to risk everything to save the woman she loves, her neighbor who is Jewish. And the stories both merge at the end of the novel in the Empire State Building. And we find that even in the face of devastation, people can find the courage to support each other and find love. So that's Counting Lost Stars.
Oh, that's fantastic. And yes, I love that you said that last part, because it's easy to see the macro and the horror, but on the micro, these people trying to save this one person close to them. It was such a beautiful story.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so we're gonna put you in the virtual green room with your virtual M&Ms or whatever you picked. For that's in your house, as Virginia likes to say. And thank you, Kim. That was so lovely, and we can't wait to hear from our next author, Mona Susan Power. Hi, Mona.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi.
All righty. How are you?
There it goes. I swear I hit it, but
You're all good. You're here. Hello. Hi.
hello.
Thank you for being here with us. I'm going to do a quick intro, and then I can't wait for you to tell our listeners more about A Council of Dolls. Mona Susan Power is an enrolled member of the Standing Rock Sioux tribe. She's the author of 3 previously published works of fiction, including her first book, The Grass Dancer, which won the Penn Hemingway Award, Sacred Wilderness, and Roofwalker. Her short stories have been published by The Atlantic Monthly, The Paris Review, and the Best American Short Stories, and more. You're a graduate of Harvard and the University of Iowa Writers Workshop. You live in Minnesota, where you're working on your new novel. Welcome. Tell us all about A Council of Dolls. It goes on sale in August.
Thank you so much for that terrific introduction. And hello, everyone. I am deeply grateful to the library marketing team, Virginia, Lena, and Grace, for inviting me to participate in this evening's event. And it is a great honor to share this platform with such remarkable writers. And I just have to say a little bit about librarians before I get to my book. I'm really thrilled to be part of a library love fest, given the significant role that libraries have played in my life. My parents first met in the world of publishing, so we're a family of book lovers. And when I was little, my mother and I would visit several different libraries each week, and librarians noted that I handled the books with great reverence. So they made an exception for me, and I was granted my first library card at the age of 2. Libraries have always been a source of inspiration and solace, opening up so many worlds for my imagination to explore. And I'll never forget librarians such as the late Mrs. Evans at the South Shore Public Library in Chicago, with her welcoming smile and encouragement, someone who held onto a story I wrote in elementary school because she saw promise in it and gave it back to us decades later. And she would also guide patrons to my published books, which she always made sure were prominently featured. So libraries are sacred spaces to me, and librarians have been some of my most protective heroes. And now I'm excited to share with you a bit of background on the latest novel, A Council of Dolls, a book that is closer to the bone than anything I've written before. This project came as a complete surprise. I was working on something else, though in one sense, I've been preparing for it my entire life. In my family, history is not history, stuck in the past, but a living connection to ancestors who are still very much invested in the doings of their relatives. My mother was a gifted storyteller with a wondrous memory for details. She enchanted me with stories of our forebears, Ihanktoane Dakota leaders and artists, including, and I think there's a slide of my great-great-grandfather, Matonupa Tuber, who came from a long line of hereditary chiefs. He is the dignified statesman shown in the photograph. And now we can move on from the slide. My mother grew up on the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation in Fort Yates, North Dakota, and like her parents, attended Indian boarding schools. So in addition to learning our Dakota culture and spiritual beliefs, I became familiar with the destructive policies of colonization, how generations of our children were stolen away from close kinship networks, landing in places that were often cruel hotbeds of abuse. And the next picture is my mother, captured in the photograph of children in a classroom. And she's the one looking directly at the audience as she cards wool with a sad, sort of peeved expression on her face. And her sister Elsie faces sideways from us, wearing a clear smirk on her face, since she's allowed to read, and my mother, whose great love is reading, is not. The photo is circa 1934, taken at the Bismarck Indian School. And then if we could move on to the next slide. The photograph of this elegant young woman holding a diploma is my grandmother, and she made that dress herself for graduation from the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in 1909. So I absorbed these histories and details, including my grandmother's tale of being a month shy of 3 years old when our beloved leader, Sitting Bull, was killed. Her father bundled her up on that bitterly cold day and held her in front of him on their horse as they rode into town to see if the awful news was true. I cherished these stories and shared them with my dolls. One in particular, a Black baby doll I carried with me everywhere, feeling how easily her warm sympathies extended to me and my loved ones, since she also knew a thing or two about racism. After all, my father had to argue with a Sears clerk in 1960s Chicago in order to purchase her, the clerk insisting he buy the white version. This baby doll, Ethel, is a major character in the novel, a multi-generational tale narrated by 3 girls, one born in 1961, the year I was born, another in 1925, the year of my mother's birth, and one in 1888, when my grandmother was born. Each girl has a precious doll that comes wholly alive to her, Ethel being joined by May, a Shirley Temple doll from the 1930s, amazed to find herself in North Dakota during the Depression, and Winona, a buckskin beaded Dakota doll who survived massacres. The reader can decide for themselves either to believe or not believe in the aliveness of these dolls. One way or the other, their girls have manifested them in times of great challenge when allies were sorely needed. I feel as if I myself benefited from the presence of these imagined dolls who took me on a journey of healing a past that has haunted my present for far too long. As one narrator says near the end of the book, words can undo us or restore us to wholeness. I pray that mine will be medicine. Thanks so much for listening.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing this book, your words. It can be great medicine. And thank you for sharing some of your family stories with those photos. Those are lovely. Yeah, thank you. And I just want to quickly read this really great quote before we move on. Oscar Hokia said, "A council of dolls absorbs through the skin, enters the bone, and disperses through the psyche. It perfectly captures the internal roots of the Native experience." Oh,
He's
beautiful.
very kind. That was very kind.
He means it. It's very beautiful. Thank you, Mona. And over to my colleague Grace for the next introduction.
Thanks, Lainey. Next, we have Lena Andrews, the author of Valiant Women. Lena, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
All right, quick introduction about Lena. Lena is a military analyst for the CIA. She has a PhD in political science from MIT, specializing in international relations and security studies. Andrews has spent over a decade in foreign policy, having previously worked at the United States Institute of Peace and the RAND Corporation, and is always looking for fresh takes on old stories, which I feel like you definitely did with this book, and I will let you take it away.
Great. Well, thank you so much for including me in this group of such talented company and lovely company, I might add. I am delighted to be here. I'm delighted to be sharing a virtual room with librarians, not just because, as Mona said, librarians tend to be some of those wonderful people I know, but because I'm feeling especially indebted to librarians as I bring this book into the world. As some of you may have guessed, this was a COVID lockdown project, which made doing research at over 14 archives and library and historical institutions very, very difficult. But for the extraordinary commitment and passion for this topic of archivists and librarians, this book would not exist. So I am feeling very, very grateful, very excited to be here in this room chatting with you. I'm excited for your questions. And if there's anything you want from me, now is the time to ask, because I am just so indebted to this wonderful community for enabling this book to come to life in what can only be considered extraordinary circumstances for research. So thank you. The book itself is called Valiant Women, and as the subtitle suggests, it's about American women who served in uniform in World War II. And if you read anything about the book before you arrived here today, you'll know that about 350,000 women served in uniform in every service, so Army, Navy, Marine Corps, Coast Guard, Army, Air Force, Medical Corps, pretty much everywhere there were women in World War II, and they were in uniform. And I mean that literally. They were also in every theater, at home and abroad, and in most jobs that were available at the time. The book itself is split into two big parts. The first part is sort of tracing the development of the women's programs, and it answers some basic questions that I had when I learned about this story. Things like, why for the first time in American history in 150 years of military conflict did we decide and concede that women should be formally a part of the military in World War II? Questions like, who were these women? Where did they come from? How were they recruited? Who led these women? What qualifications did they have? How were they trained? How did they do at boot camp? Those sorts of things that piqued my interest in the story are really the meat of the first part of the book. The second part of the book shifts gears a little bit. And there's a reason for that, which I can talk about a little bit in the Q&A, but it really takes the reader to the field, to the combat scenarios that the United States and allies were facing throughout the war. So as I mentioned, women were everywhere, and you'll see that throughout the book. Essentially, what we're tracing is the progress of the war itself, but from the perspective of specific women who served. So, for instance, you'll meet women who perform essential and totally overlooked tasks like army nurses storming the beaches in North Africa. You'll meet Navy women who are battling pack rats the size of raccoons, which is not a pleasant task, if you can imagine it, while they're packed out in the Pacific supporting Navy forces there. So there's all sorts of stories that you'll sort of trace that help us trace the progress of the war itself. And that really occupies the second big part of the book. I also highlight and don't shy away from some of the difficulties that these women face, the controversies involved in serving in the military at this particular moment. So these things are probably familiar to anyone who knows anything about this time period, but things like sexual harassment, assault, violence, smear campaigns, racism, all of that was a part of the experience. And it's something that is woven into the book because it's a history, it's the real story. And that's what I'm trying to bring to the fore. And then at the end, I have some observations about this generation and their sort of contribution to the larger women's movement, which sort of form a coda for the larger conversation about what and how they contributed to where we are today. For those of you who are worried, perhaps, that this sounds a little bit like a recitation of historical facts, I promise you that although I am a social scientist, I try not to write like one. So what I really do is try and make a narrative story that brings the reader along. And as was just said in the introduction by Grace, it's really supposed to be a fresh take to teach you something new about World War II by using the specific stories of women to shine a light on some of the key events and moments in this landmark conflict. So take, for instance, women like Catherine Keene, who was from California and a really good typist, which not necessarily a set of credentials that were particularly unique at the time. But it turns out that the Office of Strategic Services, the predecessor to the CIA, really needed typists, and they needed them in London in 1944 to trace German military equipment. And she becomes sort of the point person for understanding German military capabilities. Or women like Charity Adams, who is the first Black woman to command an army unit of Black women in Europe, or women like Mary Sears, who had not one, not two, but 3 degrees from Harvard when she joined the Navy, and was an expert in oceanography of all things, which doesn't sound very interesting, but if you're a Navy commander planning dozens of landings in World War II in the Pacific Islands, it turns out it's very helpful to have someone who knows something about ocean tides and currents, and that becomes Mary Sears. So you'll meet all of these women throughout the course of the book. And as you do, you'll also sort of trace the key events of World War II. And when I say all women, I mean all women. Unfortunately, I think a lot of the narrative about World War II has been focused on white women, where it has been focused on women at all. And something that I really try and do in this book is make centered the experiences of women of color, of lesbian and queer women, not just because they're interesting stories, but because I'm telling the whole story. And so I want these to be at the center where they were at the time. And I hope what you'll find in reading this book is that when we take this sort of newer, fuller, bigger perspective about how World War II was fought and won and the women in it, you'll uncover lots of substantively interesting things too, things about support and logistics and the importance of resources in fighting a large-scale conventional war, which for any of you who follow the news is increasingly back in the headlines. But at a minimum, I hope it'll make you the most interesting person at your cocktail party, because not only will you have some very, very heartwarming, heartbreaking, and hilarious stories about women in World War II, but you'll also have something new to say about what seems like sometimes a stale conflict. So I encourage you to pick up the book, give it a try, and learn, about some of these incredible women. So a couple of them featured here. I'll go top left first. These are two women in taking a German Afrika Korps prisoner. So they're in North Africa, probably around 1943. You can see they're looking very discerningly at him, and you can't see it as well in this photo, but he's got a little Nazi insignia on his sleeve. So that's how you know he's a German prisoner. And the top right, those are the women of the Santo Tomas internment camp, which was a major internment camp in the Philippines run by the Japanese. They were the first women to be interned in the earliest days of the conflict. They were there for almost 4 years, so almost the entire duration of the war. On the bottom left, that's that unit that I was talking to that was led by Charity Adams, and that's several Black women in uniform sorting through mail in Europe. That was their main job. It was an essential task, and they were exceptionally good at it. And then on the bottom right, we have a Coast Guard, a really tough-looking Coast Guard spar. That was what they were called, and she is towing a seaplane with a skeptical man. I can tell, I can't see his face, but he looks skeptical, but she knows what she's doing. So it's just a little visual of sort of what the range of things women were doing and the range of places they were doing them. So I look forward to your questions in the conversation, and thank you again for having me.
Thank you, Lena. I have a background, my undergrad was in history, and I've read a lot of books that felt like grueling tasks to get through, and this was not one of them. I was captivated the whole time, and you are just such a wonderful and accessible writer. So I'm really excited for people to read this one.
Thank you so much.
And next we have Jennifer Chiaverini. Hi, Jennifer.
Hi there.
Thanks for being here. A
thank you.
little bit about you. Jennifer Chiaverini is the New York Times bestselling author of 33 novels, including acclaimed historical fiction and beloved Elm Creek Quilt series. In 2020, the Wisconsin Library Association awarded her with their Outstanding Achievement Award for her novel, Resistance Women. She is a graduate of the University of Notre Dame and the University of Chicago and lives in Madison, Wisconsin. So thank you so much for being here and for writing this beautiful book about the Canary Girls. And I will stop talking and let you take it away.
Well, thank you so much. It's such an honor to be here, to be a part of this wonderful event, and to be included among these so talented authors. I can't wait to read all of their books. And I'm especially happy to be here because, as some of the other authors have mentioned, for me too, libraries have been such an important part of my life. I discovered my love of storytelling and of books at the library, the little branch library where I was growing up. And my first real job when I was in high school was working as a page at the Thousand Oaks City Library. And being amongst all those people who loved books and loved learning and loved providing resources to the community, books and newspapers and all kinds of other resources. It was as much a part of my education as attending high school was. So I'm always so grateful for libraries for playing such an important part of my life, both then and now. Well, my new novel, which will be coming out in August, is called Canary Girls. And I discovered the idea for this novel while I was writing my previous book, Switchboard Soldiers, about the American telephone operators who worked for the US Army Signal Corps during World War I. And while my American telephone operators were traveling to deployment in France, they did stop in the UK, which meant that I needed to do some research to find out what the circumstances were like in the UK during World War I. And that was just for a few chapters in that book, but it sparked so many different ideas. One of the things that was fascinating to me is that by the time my telephone operators arrived in Britain, they had already been enduring almost 4 years of terrible, devastating war. There were shortages of every kind of supply, food and necessities. They had been subjected to bombings. And of course, so many of the men were away fighting, or so many of them had lost their lives and would not be coming back. And one of the things that was most intriguing to me was to see how women had filled in for the men in almost every aspect of working life. And this really fascinated me because I was familiar with the idea of Rosie the Riveter, that iconic archetype of a woman from World War II in the US, but it hadn't occurred to me that her foremothers might have paved the way for her, a generation earlier, when another conflict had required women to respond with courage and to venture into areas from which they had previously been excluded. So early in the Great War in Great Britain, they found themselves desperately short of munitions, not really prepared to fight this unexpected war on the scale that it was fighting. So with all of the Tommies away fighting in France and Belgium and at sea, they found themselves very short of labor. Really, the only choice at this point was to tap this vastly underrepresented labor market of women. And if you could show my first slide, please, my first photo. These are 2 examples of some of the recruiting posters that went up all over Britain, trying to get women to come in and to take these munitions jobs. Now, munitions did mean bombs, it did mean shells and bullets, but it also referred to any kind of war material, such as airplanes and, trains and all kinds of other equipment that was made. And these recruiting posters were side by side with the posters recruiting men to join the military. And thousands upon thousands of women responded and answered the nation's call. Some of these women had worked in other factories. Others had worked in domestic service as housemaids, cooks, nannies. Some had worked as shop clerks, and some had never worked outside the home at all. So these women were, some of them had some initial training, others learned when they were in the factories, but they were nicknamed munitionettes. And if you can show my second photo, this is a group of women who are munitionettes. They look a little, some of them are smiling, some of them look a little like they know they need to get back to the job at hand. And the women took on almost all of the same jobs that the men did before they departed for the war. There were some jobs that were considered so essential that those men were protected from the draft and they were not permitted to enlist. But other than that, women took over every aspect of the production process. Some of the jobs that they did required great physical strength and brute force, while others required them to have a delicate touch and a steady hand. Wherever they worked, these munitionettes served long, grueling shifts, sometimes 6 or even 7 days a week in factories that could be in the industrial district of a city or could be out in the remote countryside. But whatever job these women undertook, the munitions plants were almost always deafeningly loud, teeming with noxious fumes, unheated in winter and stifling in summer. And as you can imagine, they were filled with the dangers that are going to be inherent in the manufacture of explosives. But some of these munitionettes faced even more insidious dangers than that. Could you show my next photo, please? This is an example of one of our munitionettes. Now, as production ramped up and as the months went by, troubling reports began to emerge from factories that munitionettes who worked with the yellow powder, or TNT, were suffering from unexplained illnesses. They complained of a variety of just a bewildering array of symptoms: chest pains, sore throats, bad coughs, metallic taste in their mouths, vomiting, anemia. It just ran the whole spectrum, and it was really unclear what was going on. Eventually, the women who worked with the TNT developed a particular symptom that marked them as those type of workers. Their skin turned yellow, and this earned them the nickname of Canary Girls. You can put that slide away for a little while. So as the rumors spread about all of these emerging illnesses, there were even things there were accounts of very young women who died. So many became unable to work, others did lose their lives. And then there were occurrences of women workers who gave birth to yellow-skinned babies. Now, a lot of medical experts came in and were trying to figure out what was going on. And, they eventually realized that the yellow tinge of the skin wasn't because of the yellow color of the powder, but it was because of damage to the women's internal organs. And to their credit, when they discovered that, that the work the women were doing, the work the women did was toxic and was causing them great harm, they did instill a lot of security measures. But some of the women had to leave because they were no longer capable of working. But a great many of them, even after they knew the dangers, they stayed on the job. And a common refrain that you would hear from them was, "The lads risk their lives in the trenches. We risk our lives in the arsenals." So they really saw this as their war service, just as their brothers and sweethearts and neighbors were off fighting in the trenches, the arsenals were their trenches, and that's where they fought, and that's where they served king and country. So some of the problems that you can imagine, in addition to the women's health, were there was a lot of outcry about, letting women do this kind of work was going to overturn the social order, and it would make the men less feminine, make the women less feminine. It would make them unsatisfied to become good wives and mothers when peacetime came. But for the most part, the government surely, and the public at large, were very grateful for the women's service, especially when they really understood the risks that they faced every single day, whether it's from disease or from accidents and explosions that would take place in the factories. One other thing that I found particularly interesting when I was studying these women was that they not only filled in for the men in the factories and in the plants and in the warehouses and in all other workplaces that traditionally they had been excluded from, but they also filled in for the men on the football pitch, the soccer field, as we would call it here in the US. With professional football almost entirely shut down for the duration, except for occasional charity matches or special matches for veterans, the women filled in. There was it first started out as kind of a recreational thing. The different factories would have their own football club for their workers, so that on their breaks and on their lunch breaks and after work, they could get together and kick the ball around and have fun. But as more of these teams developed, then they began having matches with their crosstown rivals. And it really just took off from there. A Munitionettes League was formed, and it even led to a grand tournament and the awarding of the first Munitionettes Cup in October of 1918. And if you could please show my last slide, this is the Blythe Spartans. It was a group of munitionettes, and you can see them. They were known as a formidable team to face on the soccer pitch. And I hope it won't be too much of a spoiler for the novel if you notice that that cup down there right in front of them for that they won. And what I just absolutely love about this image is the women's proud smiles and their strong stance. And when I heard about this, I'm a big fan of the movie League of Their Own. And I thought, oh my gosh, this story, it's like A League of Their Own meets Rosie the Riveter, except it's in Great Britain during World War I, and it's soccer instead of baseball. And I said, oh, well, it's going to be a great story. I have to pull these two different threads of women's wartime activities together. And that was a lot of fun for me to do, to explore how not only were they showing courage and determination in the workplace, but then they were also learning to test their limits and to see what really can women achieve, and all of the benefits of fair play and teamwork and athletic achievement at a time when football was considered not really a suitable sport for women. It was, too aggressive, it was too energetic, and women weren't really supposed to play. But women actually had been playing football in Britain since the 1880s, but really not in a large organized format until around this time in World War I. At first the public didn't take women's football seriously, but as the popularity grew and as they saw more of these women on the football pitch, they really were won over by their athleticism, their competitive spirit, and also by the dignity they showed in victory or defeat. So you can put away our champion football team photo for now, and I'll take it back. But I wrote Canary Girls to honor the brave, loyal munitionettes whose perseverance and sacrifice broke ground for women in athletics as well as the workplace, because my research showed me that in the factories and on the football pitches, they confronted discrimination and they challenged expectations for women, redefining women's roles for generations to follow afterward. So that's just a little introduction to my new book. And I just fell in love with these brave, strong women, and I wanted to share their story. And I hope that librarians and their patrons will enjoy the book as much as I enjoyed writing it.
Thanks, Kim. I love that last photo too. They all look very stoic in that. Or sorry, Jennifer, they all look so stoic, and just great photo of them in the soccer field. So I want to have everybody come back on screen, right, Lady? Yeah. So
Yeah,
we're doing
everybody come back on. I'm going to change the view so everybody can be seen.
I just wanted to call out all the wonderful comments we're having. Someone said, Kim, I've never heard of this story before. Mona, thank you for sharing these photos of your family. Lena, thank you for telling us these important histories. Someone called out that their mother served in World War II in the Marines. Jennifer, someone said that they're mesmerized every time you speak and lose track of time. Just lots of love coming in from librarians, and I hope you're feeling that. And definitely go read these comments when you're done here. Very beautiful.
Thank you, Grace. And thank you to all of you. I could look through photos like you've shown tonight. I think that just brings these stories to life in another way, where you can feel it from those photos. So thank you so much for bringing all of them. And I think even just listening to everyone commenting about all of these women in history and thinking of the weight that women in history have held is insane. So thank you for bringing these stories to light. I have a question for everyone. I think that'll kick us off. So empowering women seem to be, the theme of the book. So can we talk about why it's important to uplift women's stories from the past and what we can learn from them in the present? And I'm going to just pick Lena.
Easy question. Thank you. And a good one. For me, and I think this is probably true of the other authors on the screen here, so much of what I read and researched and came to understand about these stories in the 40s just were so resonant today. And I think now more than ever, understanding the whole picture, the whole story, is just so important. And in my little sliver of the world where I think a lot about sort of the integration of military forces, questions about whether and who should serve and why and how and what restrictions should be placed on them. These are all debates that were, asked and answered in 1942. It's just we keep having them over and over again. And so part of what I think is really important about the story that I wrote and many of the stories that are being told here is to say we've done this before. We've gotten to the answer, not always quite correctly, but we've gotten there. So let's listen to our former selves for once. So I think so much of this for me is just bringing that to a wider audience, letting people understand that. And in my particular sliver of history, I think the greatest generation, and particularly the women in it, tend to be a bit forgotten in the larger women's movement, largely because in the 50s, they, went home and they, as Kim points out, had often very treacherous paths back to the, having a seat at the table. And so much of what I think is important about empowerment is understanding the full scope of what the generations before us have brought. And of course, Mona's story also touches on that so beautifully. So I think, really unpacking the full lineage of those things has been such a moving and wonderful part of my own research. So that's what I would say.
If anyone wants to jump in, but Kim, do you want to say anything?
Sure. I think one of the things that was really interesting for me is learning a lot more about the early history of women in computing. And it was kind of fun challenge because I really don't have any background in computer science, but I actually wrote my dissertation about computers because when I started grad school, that's when we were first using word processing instead of typewriters, like the one I have it sort of in memoriam in my writing room. And to learn more about how women were so involved in the development, especially of programming computers. And it's something that, again, we were, like Lena was saying, we're saying, well, we need to get women more involved in STEM fields and in technology. And we were there at the beginning. And then as it becomes amazing and interesting, get put off to the side. And so it's like, it's not claiming a seat at the table, it's reclaiming it. And so I really liked combining that story with a story of a young woman going through a really difficult experience that was very typical. My mom told me about her friend from high school who went away for 6 months, and when she came back, like, okay, that never happened. But of course, you carry that with you your whole life, and what do you do with that? So it's I look at those early histories of women and their involvement, and really want to make them feel present again.
I love that. Not claiming or reclaiming the seat at the table. I love that. Yeah, Mona.
If I had a startled look on my face, we had a tornado siren go off.
Okay.
Beginning to ask that question, but it's gone off just now. So, okay.
We can go to someone else. Please, everyone be safe. This is not what I care about.
Anyway, so that's just a terrific question. And it's something that I've actually thought about for a long time, how my experience was often very different from those of my non-native friends and classmates, because I feel as if in bringing forward through fiction, stories inspired by my family experiences, I'm just continuing a long tradition of Indigenous women being quite powerful in our communities, having economic power, political power, certainly power within the families. And so, thinking back on the early feminists and how they were so inspired by the Haudenosaunee women on the East Coast, seeing, how much political power they had. And so I grew up in a family where the women were the leaders and activists. My grandmother, whose photograph was shown in her graduation dress when she graduated from Carlisle, we come from a line of hereditary chiefs. And so with that comes great responsibility, even though she was raising 6 children during very hungry times during the Depression. She would tell them always, chief's family eats last. We have to look out for everyone else first. And even though she had brothers, she had male relatives of her generation, she was the one who was asked to take these leadership roles. And she actually became chairperson of our tribe in the 1940s, and would go to Washington. And back then she didn't have money, so she'd just have a paper bag with some food and some clothes, and she'd be hitchhiking to Washington D.C. to try to meet with the president. She got as far as Eleanor Roosevelt, was trying to get her in to see President Roosevelt, but it didn't quite work out. And my mother was one of the founders of the American Indian Center in Chicago, which was the first center of its kind in the country, and was an incredible activist. So I always thought women ruled the world. And then I start going to school where I'm the only Native kid in most of the, the classes, and I'm being told, oh, your women were oppressed. And I was like, no, we can be pretty ferocious. On the other hand, that's not to dismiss the problems we now have with domestic abuse, domestic violence, the missing and murdered Indigenous women, horrendous problem that we have. And I think part of this stems from generations that were taken to these Indian boarding schools. And so our kinship networks were not completely destroyed, but great damage was done to them. Child rearing practices were often destroyed because you had children coming back who had been tortured, sexually abused in other ways in these schools. They didn't know how to parent in a healthy way anymore. So that's now, come down and harm so many generations that it's trying to remind us who we come from. We come from incredibly healthy societies with these, you can't be doing a lot of things in the dark to your family and your children if you have these extended kinship networks where everybody has a responsibility of looking out for their nieces and their nephews and different generations. And you don't have just one set of parents you're living with behind closed doors. So trying to use this book and this story as a way of healing myself, certainly, but hopefully being a healing influence to others who might have lost touch with our really wonderful history.
Oh. And we have a lot of questions to get through. So Jennifer, please comment on that question, but you have a couple of specific ones. So I don't know if you want to include that in an answer.
Well, sure. I'll give a quick response,
okay, cool.
Because everyone else has already spoken so eloquently and beautifully, and I'm just like going, yes, that's so right, yes. But I'll say one reason in all of my historical fiction, I always like to focus on women, whether I'm writing about a historical woman or if it's a fictionalized version. I like to focus on women who have made achievements and who have had achievements and they've made contributions, but their stories somehow ended up in the footnotes of someone else, usually a man, footnotes of someone else's story, if they made it into the novel, if they made it into the narrative at all. And one thing that readers often tell me at book signings and at meetings at libraries and book club things is they say, why didn't I know about her? Whether they're talking about Elizabeth Van Loo from The Spy Mistress or Grace Banker from Switchboard Soldiers. Why didn't we learn about these women in history class? Their stories should be remembered. So for me, we didn't get it in history class, at least not when I was taking history classes. So I feel like if I didn't know this woman's story and I think it's important, then I bet a lot of other readers out there are going to feel the same way. And in this way, I feel like I'm honoring their memory. And I'm also letting women and girls today know that we were contributing all along. Our stories might have been unsung, but we were there. And here are a few women that you can admire and you can look up to as a role model when you're thinking about, finding courage to face challenges in your own life. So.
I think all of us are snapping, and yeah, you can see all of our heads. That was wonderful. Thank you. Grace, do you want to get into some of the questions? I don't know.
Yeah, we have so many. I'm just amazed at this response right now. I have one for everyone again. What is one feeling or thought you most hope readers come away with after reading these books? I know that's probably a huge question. So whoever wants to start, if the spirit moves you, go ahead.
Well, I'll say something about not just about this book, but about all of my historical fiction. And that's that, although I tend to write about women in pretty challenging times, whether they're, trying to fight for the vote or if they're dealing with wartime issues. But one of the things I hope readers will take away from the stories of these courageous women is this sense of hope. I know that today and, coming out of the pandemic, I'm one of the few people who think we are still in a pandemic. Sometimes I feel like I'm alone thinking that. But we in the United States right now and worldwide, but, I'm focusing mostly on, what I see on the news and in around our own country. We're going through some pretty tough times. And, when we have so many issues that we're grappling with. And sometimes I feel that, if we look to the past and we see how our foremothers and, women, children, men, how they faced difficult times before. And usually by pulling together, by working together, united in a common cause, they've been able to overcome those difficulties. And so when I'm looking at some of the challenges that we face today and they feel rather overwhelming to me, I think we've been through difficult times before. History has taught us that we have faced challenges before. The challenges of World War II, the challenges of the Jim Crow era. Our foreparents faced those challenges and they got through them. We are still working on a lot of the problems that they were facing then, but now we have the challenges of our day. We can take inspiration and hope from the way people of previous generations, even if it's going back centuries, how they faced their challenges and overcame them. They did it, and that gives me the sense that, all right, now we've got these difficult problems that we would rather not have faced in our time. But these are the problems of our time, and we too can face them just like the generations who came before us did.
Actually, my response is very much connected to yours. It's very much a healing book. It is about intergenerational trauma, but it doesn't leave the reader there. The whole purpose of it is trying to inspire people to say there really is a way through this. And it's not by pretending what happened didn't happen. I think there have been generations, at least in my family, where people were struggling so much simply to survive and help their children to survive. They didn't have the emotional bandwidth, the resources to be able to work on self-healing, which sounds so incredibly selfish in a bad way. But my book sort of makes the argument that that's where you have to begin, actually. And self-healing is really a collective act, or it has collective benefits, because what you have to offer the rest of the world when you are standing on healthier ground is so much better. Some stability. We need more people to be stable these days, right? I'm talking about the news that we read. It's like, oi, oi, oi. And so, I myself, I would, the earlier younger me would have been horrified that I'm this open about it, but now I'm talking about the mental health challenges that I've gone through, where I've lost years, if not decades of my life to debilitating depression and anxiety and PTSD. And really coming through that and landing in a better place and having so much more to offer others. And so, yeah, my book is really, with my book, I hope to give others solace and hope and inspiration that it is possible. It really is possible, even when you're an old goat like me.
I too am an old goat.
Really beautiful.
I think with my novel, with Counting Lost Stars, there's a message about courage and about community. But another point that I'm really interested in exploring is this way that technology amplifies whatever it's applied to, and that it's not neutral. It's not like you can do a fun thing on a computer or a bad thing on a computer. The whole design of the technology is about efficiency, and that's not just a neutral thing, that to see even people as human resources, to see the world in terms of how it can be used efficiently is a way of seeing things. We don't feel like it's a choice anymore because we're so enmeshed in it. But by going back to looking at this true historical thing, how computers were used to organize the Holocaust, it could not have been as devastating as it was without that efficiency. It kind of, for me, gets to a really specific moment that you can look at and spark that conversation about how are we connected? How are we not only using technology, but how is it influencing how we understand the world around us? And it's just a question that's really, I think, a really interesting one to discuss and be aware of.
That we're having today, what new technology is affecting us and how is it affecting us?
Yeah.
Right.
I think that's exactly right, Kim. And I originally was going to say something very similar, which was pride, but you sort of have skewed me in a different direction, which is I hope that readers feel a sense of familiarity with what they read. And I think this gets to what both Jennifer and Mona said as well. And even the comment that you just mentioned, almost the reaction to when I tell people this story is, oh, actually, I think my aunt, grandmother, mother, sister, great aunt served in World War II. And there's this instant recognition of it being, a part of our collective story because everyone is in these landmark events, everyone is a part of them. And I hope that familiarity breeds some pride. I hope it breeds some inspiration. I also hope it breeds some reflection about why we don't know the stories of our grandmothers and mothers and aunts. And, certainly many of, I think about this all the time. We're losing veterans of World War II every day. And we're losing, veterans of more recent wars every day. And so I always exhort people that if you find something familiar in this, if it cues something in you, to ask a veteran what their experience was like, and to listen very carefully, particularly if they're a woman. And so I really hope that this resonates with people, that it feels familiar, because I think a lot of these wars and these times can feel very sort of swoony and foreign and like a totally different experience, when in fact, as I think Jennifer started off by saying, all of this is just, a sort of different flavor of a past experience. So I hope it feels familiar to people.
Yeah, Lena, I'll just say that reading your book reminded me one of my high school teachers was a ferry pilot. Yes. And I had forgotten that I interviewed her for like a high school paper, and it was just so neat to have that that connection sparked in my memory by reading your book. So thank you.
Absolutely. And she was an excellent flyer. I know it.
That's so important too. Asking our, family members and people we are surrounded by, their stories, like you said, they're a resource that can always be there. So important. So I know there's a lot of love. There's a lot of questions. You can go back and see yourselves after, and maybe when we're officially live, we can check in with our group and see if they have a couple minutes to spare for some extra material. We'll check in with you. But before we go, we have 1 or 2 minutes left. So I just want to quickly ask if anyone would like to share what they're working on next. Do Do you want me
Well,
to call or
And
find it out?
the next thing I want to do is read all the books that I've heard about today.
Yeah.
And I bet a lot of the librarians feel the same way.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
I'm
I
actually
was.
gonna sorry.
Oh, go ahead, Mona, please.
I'm going to return to the novel that I was working on before. This one just kind of interrupted and shoved everything else out of the way and demanded that I give it love and attention now. And so the working title is very long. Harvard Indian Seance at the Lizzie Borden Bed and Breakfast.
I love it.
So
What a title. Amazing.
Oh.
I would
it's
read
an
that.
Indigenous
100%.
academic horror novel.
That's fantastic.
Incredible.
I need it right now, actually.
Yeah, right up my alley.
I'm after spending most of the pandemic lockdown researching Holocaust topics, which was like, stress on top of sadness. I'm writing a new book about women artists in the 1950s in New York City.
Beautiful. I'm learning as a debut author that your next book depends very much on the success of your first one. So I'm taking notes about how to do this from the other authors on the screen. But like so many, I think there are several amazing stories. The one that's got my wheels turning is a group called the 99s, which were a group of women pilots at the turn of the century who were like, if Serena Williams and, Kim Kardashian and Elon Musk were one person in 1920, these were the women. They were so cool. They were so smart. They were so talented. And so few people know about them. So I've been thinking a lot about them recently.
That is the most unique way I've ever heard someone describe them, but also incredibly accurate.
Well, it's very contemporary. I'm not sure they would necessarily like that, but it's how I think of them.
Well, they wouldn't know. So.
Yeah, right on.
All righty. Well, thank you so much. This has just been the loveliest way to spend the evening, and I can't tell people more. If you haven't already gotten the eGalley, all library people who work in a library can be whitelisted, so let us know. If you haven't, you can read these right now, and I really encourage you to, because they will stay with you for a really long time. Thank you for being gracious with your time tonight and just writing these beautiful stories.
Thank you
Thank
for
you
having
so
us.
much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all. This is such a joy.